Tonight we are going back in time. We are going to a world of castles and cathedrals, of armoured horsemen and tournament fields, of kings who ruled by the sword and the men who stood beside them. We are going to the Middle Ages, to the tumultuous, violent, and strangely beautiful world of 12th and 13th century England and France. And we are going to tell the story of a man whom his contemporaries called, without exaggeration or irony, the greatest knight who ever lived. Before we begin, take a moment to settle yourself. Let your body grow heavy and warm. Let your breathing slow to a gentle, natural rhythm. The story we are about to tell stretches across more than 7 decades of a single extraordinary life. A life that spanned the reigns of 5 English kings, that rose from obscurity to the very pinnacle of power, and that became, in its own time, and in the centuries that followed, the very definition of knightly honour. But there is no need to rush. The past is patient, and so is the telling. Let the words come to you like the slow turning of manuscript pages, steady, measured, and calming, and let them carry you wherever they will. The world into which our story is set was a world in motion. The 12th century was an age of extraordinary energy and ambition, when the great kingdoms of Western Europe were being forged in war and diplomacy, when the Crusades sent tens of thousands of men eastward to fight for the Holy Land, when the great cathedrals of Chartres and Notre Dame and Canterbury were rising stone by stone toward the sky, and when the code of chivalry, that complex and sometimes contradictory set of ideals that governed the behaviour of the mounted warrior class, was reaching its fullest expression. Chivalry. The word itself comes from the French chevalerie, meaning horsemanship, and it carried within it a whole world of meaning. To be a knight was not simply to be a soldier on horseback. It was to be a member of an elite class, bound by oaths of loyalty and honour, trained from childhood in the arts of war and the manners of the court, expected to be brave in battle, generous to the defeated, faithful to one's lord, and courteous to all. It was an ideal, of course, and like all ideals, it was honoured as often in the breach as in the observance. Many knights were brutal, grasping and faithless, but the ideal existed, and it shaped the culture and the imagination of the age in ways that are still felt today, in our stories, our literature, and our sense of what it means to be honourable and brave. And of all the men who embodied that ideal, of all the knights who rode the tournament fields and the battlefields of medieval Europe, none embodied it more fully, more consistently, and more spectacularly than William Marshal. His is a story that reads like a romance, like one of the great chivalric tales that the troubadours sang in the halls of castles and palaces. It is a story of a younger son with no inheritance and no prospects, who, through his skill at arms, his loyalty, his political intelligence, and his sheer force of character, rose to become the most powerful man in England, regent of the realm, protector of the young king, defender of the kingdom against invasion and civil war. It is a story that would, 8 centuries later, inspire one of the most beloved fictional knights in modern literature. But we shall come to that in good time. For now, let us begin where all the best stories begin, at the beginning. Part 1. The Fourth Son. William Marshal was born around the year 1146 or 1147, in the midst of one of the most chaotic periods in English history. His father was John Fitzgilbert, a minor baron who held the hereditary office of Marshal, an official responsible for the management of the royal household's horses, a position of modest but real importance in a world where the horse was the instrument of war and the symbol of aristocratic power. The family was respectable but not wealthy, well-connected but not powerful, and William was the fourth son, which, in the rigid inheritance customs of the medieval world, meant that he was unlikely to inherit any significant lands or titles. He would have to make his own way in the world. The England into which William was born was a country at war with itself. The long civil war known as the Anarchy fought between King Stephen and the Empress Matilda for control of the English throne had turned the country into a patchwork of warring factions and lawless territories. Castles changed hands with bewildering frequency. Barons switched allegiances as easily as they changed their cloaks. The ordinary people of England suffered terribly, caught between rival armies that burned their crops, stole their livestock, and destroyed their homes with casual indifference. It was, as one chronicler wrote, a time when Christ and his saints slept. William's father, John Fitzgilbert, was a survivor, a man who navigated the treacherous politics of the anarchy with a pragmatism that sometimes shaded into ruthlessness. When William was perhaps 5 or 6 years old, his father was besieged in one of his castles by the forces of King Stephen. As part of the negotiations for a truce, John offered his young son William as a hostage, a guarantee of his good faith. It was a common practice in the medieval world, but what happened next was not. John Fitzgilbert broke the terms of the truce. He used the time that the hostage arrangement had bought him to reinforce his castle and prepare for further resistance. When King Stephen's men threatened to kill the boy in retaliation, John reportedly sent back a message of breathtaking coldness. He said that he did not care what they did with the child, because he had, as he put it, the hammer and the anvil with which to forge still finer sons. It was a statement that tells us a great deal about the harsh realities of medieval political life, and it must have been a moment of terrifying confusion for the young William. He was a small child, far from home, in the hands of men who had every reason to harm him, and his own father had essentially told his captors that the boy was expendable. The story goes that Stephen, who was by all accounts a kindly man despite his political failings, could not bring himself to harm the child. William was kept as a hostage for a time, but was eventually returned unharmed. The experience left no recorded bitterness in William, or if it did, he buried it deep. But it must have taught him, at an impossibly young age, a lesson about the world and the people in it that would shape his entire life. That loyalty and trust are precious things, not to be given lightly, and that a man's word, once given, must be his bond. Let us pause here for just a moment and think about that little boy, 5 or 6 years old, standing in the camp of an enemy king, not fully understanding why he is there or why his father will not come for him. The fear and the confusion he must have felt, and then, somehow, surviving, being returned, growing up, and spending the rest of his long and remarkable life proving, again and again, that he was a man whose word could be trusted absolutely. as if he had made a private vow, there in Stephen's camp, that he would never be the kind of man his father had been in that terrible moment. Part 2. The Making of a Knight. William's formal training as a knight began when he was sent, as was the custom for boys of his class, to the household of a great lord, in William's case, his mother's cousin, William de Tancarville, the Chamberlain of Normandy. There, in the castle of Tancarville overlooking the Seine, the young William began the long and grueling apprenticeship that would transform him from a landless younger son into one of the most formidable warriors of his age. The training of a medieval knight was a process that began in childhood and continued for years. Boys learned to ride almost before they could walk, and by their early teens, they were expected to be proficient in the use of the lance, the sword, and the shield. They practiced on horseback, charging at targets and dummies, learning to control a powerful warhorse with their knees and their weight, while wielding heavy weapons with their arms. They trained on foot, wrestling and sparring with blunted swords, learning the techniques of close combat that could mean the difference between life and death on the battlefield. They were taught the social graces as well, how to behave at court, how to address a lady, how to conduct themselves at the table and in the hall, because a knight was expected to be as accomplished in the arts of peace as he was in the arts of war. William took to this life with a natural talent that quickly set him apart from his peers. He was tall, strong, and athletic, with a physical grace and a quickness of hand and eye that made him a natural horseman and a devastating swordsman. But it was not just his physical gifts that distinguished him. He had a quality of character, a combination of courage, composure, and good humor that earned him the respect and the affection of those around him. He was, by all accounts, a likable young man, neither boastful nor sullen, who took his training seriously but never lost his capacity for fun and fellowship. He was knighted in 1166, at approximately the age of 20, and almost immediately saw action in a skirmish during a campaign in Upper Normandy. His first battle was not a glorious success. In the chaos of the fighting, William threw himself into the action with more enthusiasm than tactical sense, and though he fought bravely, he managed to lose his horse. A disaster for a knight, since the war horse was not merely a mount, but a weapon of war, and an extremely expensive one at that. William found himself unhorsed and nearly penniless, with nothing to show for his first military engagement, but bruises and a lesson in the importance of practical warfare. It was a humbling start, but William Marshal was not the kind of man to be discouraged by a setback. He was the kind of man who learned from his mistakes, who got back on his feet, or more precisely, back on a horse, and who came back stronger than before. And the arena in which he would prove himself, the arena that would make his name and his fortune, was the tournament. Part 3. The Tournament Circuit. The tournament of the 12th century was nothing like the elegant, ritualized jousting that we see depicted in films and television. It was not a single knight charging at another knight with a lance across a neatly fenced enclosure. It was instead something much closer to organized warfare, a chaotic, violent, and enormously exciting event that could involve hundreds of mounted knights charging across miles of open countryside, fighting in swirling melees that could last for hours, capturing opponents and holding them for ransom, and generally behaving in ways that were indistinguishable from actual battle, except for the somewhat notional understanding that the aim was to capture rather than to kill. Tournaments were the great spectacles of the age. They drew knights from across Europe, eager to test their skills, to make their reputations, and to earn money, because the ransoms paid by captured knights could be enormous, and a successful tournament fighter could become wealthy very quickly. They were also dangerous. Men were regularly injured, and deaths, though not the intention, were far from uncommon. The church disapproved of tournaments, regarding them as occasions of sin, vanity, violence, and the risk of killing a fellow Christian, and periodically attempted to ban them, with a notable lack of success. William Marshal discovered in the tournament the perfect expression of his talents. He was a natural, fast, strong, tactically intelligent, and possessed of a reckless courage that bordered on the joyful. He rode into the melee with an abandon that thrilled spectators and terrified opponents, and he quickly developed a reputation as one of the most formidable tournament fighters in Europe. He fought not just with physical skill, but with a shrewd strategic sense, choosing his moments carefully, picking his targets wisely, and knowing when to press the attack and when to hold back. In the chaos of the melee, and sharing the chaos of the melee, and sharing the ransoms of the knights they captured. In a single tournament season, William and Roger captured 103 knights, a staggering number that made them both rich and famous. The ransoms alone were worth a small fortune, and William, who had arrived on the tournament circuit with nothing but his skill and his ambition, was suddenly a man of means. But it was more than just money. The tournament circuit gave William something even more valuable: a reputation. In the world of the 12th century aristocracy, a man's reputation was his most important asset. It opened doors, attracted patrons, won friendships, and created opportunities. And William's reputation was growing with every tournament he fought. He was becoming known as the finest knight of his generation, a man who combined extraordinary martial skill with a generosity and a courtesy that endeared him to allies and opponents alike. He was the kind of knight that the troubadours sang about, the kind of knight that every young squire dreamed of becoming. There is a story from this period that captures the essence of William Marshal perfectly. After one particularly grueling tournament, the heralds came looking for William to award him the prize for the best knight on the field. They searched the banqueting hall, the tents, the stables. They could not find him anywhere. Eventually, someone suggested that they look at the blacksmith's forge. And there, they found William, his head resting on the anvil, while the blacksmith worked to hammer off a helmet that had been so battered and dented during the fighting that it could not be removed by ordinary means. William had been hit so many times during the melee that his helmet had been beaten out of shape and was stuck on his head. He received the prize with characteristic good humour, standing there in the forge with the sweat and the soot, and the blacksmith still working at his helmet, and the story spread across the tournament circuit, adding yet another layer to the growing legend of William Marshal. Part 4. Keeper of Kings. William's reputation on the tournament circuit brought him to the attention of the most powerful people in Europe, and in 1170 he was appointed tutor in arms to the young King Henry. the eldest surviving son of Henry II of England, who had been crowned as co-king in a bid to secure the succession. It was an appointment that would change the trajectory of William's life, binding him to the royal house of England and setting him on a path that would lead, over the next 50 years, through the reigns of 5 English kings. The relationship between William and the young king was close and complex. William was the older man's mentor, his trainer, his protector, and, in many ways, his closest friend. He taught the young king the skills of the knight and the tournament, and the two men rode the tournament circuit together, winning prizes and glory across England and France. But the young king was a troubled figure, crowned but given no real power by his domineering father, restless and resentful, prone to extravagance and poor judgment. He rebelled against his father twice, and William, torn between his loyalty to the father and his love for the son, navigated the conflict with a care and a diplomatic skill that would become one of the hallmarks of his career. When the young king died in 1183, at the age of just 28, William was devastated. He honoured a promise he had made to the dying prince and undertook a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, carrying the young king's crusader cloak to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He spent 2 years in the Holy Land, fighting with the Knights Templar and gaining experience and connections that would serve him well in the years to come. When he returned to England, he was a man transformed, older, wiser, and more formidable than ever, with a network of relationships that spanned the Christian world. The decades that followed saw William serve, with a loyalty that never wavered, through some of the most turbulent times in English history. He served Henry II, the great Plantagenet king who built an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, but who was destroyed by the rebellions of his own sons. When Henry died in 1189, broken and betrayed, it was William Marshal who remained loyal to the end, fighting a rearguard action that allowed the old king to retreat in safety. There is a famous story that during this rearguard, William came face to face with Richard, the very prince who was pursuing his father. Richard charged at William, and William, who could easily have killed the prince, instead drove his lance into Richard's horse, unseating him, but sparing his life. It was an act that demonstrated both William's martial supremacy and his political intelligence. When Richard became king, he remembered the mercy and the loyalty, and he rewarded William rather than punishing him. Richard the Lionheart trusted William implicitly. When Richard went on crusade in 1190, he appointed William as one of the Council of Regents who would govern England in his absence. William served faithfully, navigating the treacherous politics of the Regency with a skill that earned him both respect and powerful enemies. When Richard died in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle in France, William supported the succession of John, Richard's younger brother and the most controversial king in English history. William's service to King John is perhaps the most remarkable demonstration of his loyalty and his political skill. John was, by most accounts, a difficult and untrustworthy monarch, intelligent but cruel, capable but suspicious, prone to fits of rage and acts of petty vindictiveness. His reign was marked by conflict with his barons, with the church, and with the King of France, and it culminated in the crisis that produced Magna Carta in 1215. Throughout it all, William remained loyal to the crown, even when John's behaviour tested that loyalty to its limits. He was one of the witnesses to Magna Carta, standing at the Great Charter's signing as a symbol of the compromise between the king and his rebellious barons. Part 5. A Knight's Tale, The Shadow of Duncan the Tall. Let us pause here, in the middle of our story, to draw a thread that reaches across 8 centuries, from the dusty tournament fields of medieval France to the pages of modern fantasy literature. Because the story of William Marshal, the landless younger son who rose through honour and skill to become the greatest knight of his age, is a story that echoes through one of the most beloved fictional knights ever created. Ser Duncan the Tall, the hero of George R.R. Martin's Tales of Dunk and Egg. The parallels are striking, and they are not accidental. Martin, a devoted student of medieval history, has spoken often of his fascination with the world of knights and tournaments, and the influence of figures like William Marshal on his work is clear to anyone who knows both stories. Duncan the Tall, like William Marshal, is a man of humble origins, a boy from the streets of King's Landing, with no name, no family, and no inheritance, who takes up the mantle of knighthood, and through sheer force of character, proves himself worthy of it. William Marshal, a younger son with no lands and no prospects, did the same in the real world, rising from obscurity to become the most respected man in England. Both men are defined not by their birth, but by their choices. Duncan is not born to knighthood. He is raised by a wandering hedge knight, old Sir Arlen of Pennytree, and there are hints throughout the stories that he may never have been formally knighted at all. William was born into the minor gentry, but his status as a fourth son made him effectively a man without patrimony, forced to earn through merit what others received by right. Both men enter a world of tournaments and battles as outsiders, with nothing to recommend them but their size, their courage, and their stubborn adherence to a code of honour that the world around them often treats as naive. The tournament is central to both stories. William Marshal made his name and his fortune on the tournament circuit, fighting in the great melees that were the spectacle of the 12th century. Duncan the Tall enters the lists at Ashford Meadow in what becomes one of the most dramatic trial-by-combat scenes in modern fantasy. In both cases, the tournament is not merely a test of martial skill, but a crucible of character, a place where a man reveals who he truly is, where courage is tested, where honour is proven or found wanting. William and Duncan both emerge from their trials not simply as skilled fighters, but as men of principle, men who would rather suffer than compromise their sense of what is right. And there is the loyalty. William Marshal's defining quality, the quality that made him trusted by 5 successive kings, that made him the man to whom the kingdom was entrusted in its darkest hour, was his absolute, unwavering loyalty. He served the men he swore to serve, even when those men were difficult, even when they were wrong, even when loyalty came at great personal cost. Duncan the Tall shows the same quality in his devotion to young Prince Aegon, Egg, the boy he protects and serves and accompanies through a world of danger and political intrigue. Both men understand that loyalty is not a convenience, but a commitment, not a transaction, but a bond. And both men demonstrate that the truest form of loyalty is not blind obedience, but the courage to tell your lord the truth, even when the truth is unwelcome. There is even a physical resemblance in the storytelling. Duncan the Tall is just that. Tall, enormously tall, towering over most of the men around him. William Marshal was, by the standards of his age, a big man, broad-shouldered and physically imposing, whose size and strength were as much a part of his legend as his skill with a lance. Both men are gentle giants of a sort, men whose imposing physical presence belies a fundamental kindness and a reluctance to use their strength for cruelty. It is a beautiful thing when you think about it, that the real life of a medieval knight lived 800 years ago can still echo through the imagination of a modern storyteller and touch the hearts of millions of readers. William Marshal would have understood Duncan the Tall, and Duncan would have understood William. They are brothers across time, separated by centuries, but united by a shared code. That a knight's true worth is measured not by the lands he holds or the titles he bears, but by the quality of his word and the courage of his heart. Rest on that thought for a moment. Let it settle into you like the warmth of a fire on a cold night. Part 6. The Regent of England. We return now to the story of the real William Marshal, and to the final, most extraordinary chapter of his long and remarkable life. King John died in October 1216, in the midst of a civil war that had torn England apart. The kingdom was in crisis. A French army had invaded at the invitation of the rebel barons, and the 9-year-old Henry III, John's son and heir, was a child, incapable of ruling in his own right. The country needed a leader, a man of unquestioned authority and proven loyalty, a man who could unite the warring factions and drive out the invaders. The barons, the bishops, and the surviving loyalists looked at one another, and they all agreed on the same name: William Marshal. William was 70 years old. He had been fighting, governing, and serving the crown for more than half a century. He was, by any reasonable measure, an old man, in an age when most men were old at 40. His body bore the scars of countless battles and tournaments. He had every reason to decline, to retire to his estates and live out his remaining years in peace. But William Marshal was not a man who declined. When his country needed him, he answered. He had always answered. He was appointed Regent of England, Rector Regis et Regni, ruler of the king and the kingdom, and he threw himself into the task with an energy and a determination that astonished everyone around him. His first challenge was the most pressing: the French army, led by Prince Louis of France, which occupied London and controlled much of the southeast. The rebel barons who had invited the French were beginning to have second thoughts. A French prince on the English throne was, it turned out, not quite what they had bargained for. And William exploited their doubts with a diplomatic skill that was matched only by his military prowess. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Lincoln in May 1217. William personally led the royalist army into the city, directing the attack from the saddle at the age of 70. The battle was a complete and devastating victory. The French and rebel forces were routed, their leaders captured, their army scattered. It was the last great battle of William Marshal's career, and it was, fittingly, one of his finest. The old knight, who had first drawn a sword more than 50 years earlier, rode into battle one final time and won a victory that saved the kingdom. In the aftermath of Lincoln, William moved swiftly to consolidate the peace. He offered generous terms to the defeated rebels, understanding that reconciliation was more important than revenge. He reissued Magna Carta, confirming the rights and liberties that the Charter guaranteed. And in doing so, he helped to establish the principle that even the king was subject to the law, a principle that would become one of the foundations of the English constitutional tradition. He negotiated the withdrawal of the French army, ending the invasion without further bloodshed. And he governed the kingdom with a steady, fair and competent hand, giving the young King Henry III the stable and peaceful start to his reign that the boy so desperately needed. It was, by any standard, a remarkable achievement. A 70-year-old man, at the end of a life that had already been extraordinary, found within himself the strength and the wisdom to save his country from invasion and civil war. And he did it not through cruelty or fear, but through the qualities that had defined his entire career: loyalty, courage, honor, and an unshakable sense of duty. Part 7. The Greatest Knight. William Marshal died on May 14, 1219, at his manor at Caversham, near Reading. He was in his early 70s, an extraordinary age for the time. In his final days, he arranged his affairs with the same meticulous care that had characterized his entire life. He was received into the Order of the Knights Templar, fulfilling a long-held wish, and he said his farewells to his family, his friends, and his companions with a grace and a composure that moved everyone who witnessed them. The accounts of his death, recorded in the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, the remarkable biography in verse that was commissioned by his family shortly after his death, and which remains the primary source for much of what we know about his life, paint a picture of a man at peace with himself and with the world. He knew that he was dying, and he faced death as he had faced every other challenge in his life, with courage, with dignity, and with an unshakable faith that he had done his best. He gathered his household around him and spoke to them of loyalty, of service, and of the importance of keeping one's word. He asked to be dressed in the white mantle of the Templars, and he died as a knight, as he had lived. He was buried in the Temple Church in London, where his effigy can still be seen today, a stone figure in armour, lying in repose, his hands clasped in prayer, his sword at his side. The effigy is worn and weathered by 8 centuries of time, but the face is still visible, strong, calm, and dignified, as his contemporaries described him. Visitors to the Temple Church often pass by the rows of knightly effigies without knowing which is which. But those who know the story pause before the figure of William Marshal and remember the man who lay beneath, the 4th son who became the greatest knight, the landless boy who became the regent of England, the man who served 5 kings and never broke his word. The Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, composed in the years after his death, runs to more than 19,000 lines of verse. It is the earliest known biography of a medieval knight who was not a king or a saint, and it provides an extraordinarily detailed portrait of a life lived at the heart of the medieval world. The poem's author, who may have been a member of William's household, wrote with a vividness and a humanity that bring the distant world of the 12th and 13th centuries to life in a way that few other medieval texts can match. The tournaments, the battles, the political intrigues, the friendships and rivalries, the joys and the sorrows of a long and eventful life, all are rendered in verse that is sometimes clumsy but always heartfelt, and that conveys, above all, a deep and genuine admiration for its subject. Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is reported to have said at William's funeral that he was the greatest knight in the world. It was not flattery. It was a statement of fact, recognized by everyone who had known William or known of him. In an age of warriors, he had been the finest warrior. In an age of treachery, he had been the most loyal servant. In an age when power was seized and held by force, he had wielded power with wisdom and restraint. He was, quite simply, the best of what a knight could be. Part 8. The Legacy. The legacy of William Marshal extends far beyond the events of his own life. He helped to shape the political and constitutional development of England in ways that are still felt today. His reissue of Magna Carta in 1217 and his role in establishing the principle that the king was subject to the law contributed to the development of the English common law tradition and ultimately to the constitutional principles that would influence democratic governance around the world. The man who could barely read or write helped to lay the foundations of a legal tradition that would shape the course of human history. His story also endures as a testament to a set of values, loyalty, honor, courage, service, that transcend the particular circumstances of the medieval world. In every age and in every culture, people have admired men and women who keep their word, who serve a cause greater than themselves, who face danger with composure, and who treat others with fairness and generosity. William Marshal embodied these qualities to an extraordinary degree, and his story continues to inspire because these are qualities that never go out of fashion. And as we noted earlier, his story lives on in the fiction it has inspired. When George R.R. Martin created Ser Duncan the Tall, that gentle, stubborn, impossibly honourable hedge knight who wanders the roads of Westeros with a boy prince at his side, fighting for what is right and refusing to bend, even when bending would be easier. He was drawing, whether consciously or not, on a tradition of knightly heroism that finds its fullest real-world expression in the life of William Marshal. The line runs straight and true from the tournament fields of 12th century France to the pages of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and it carries with it a message that is as old as chivalry itself. That true nobility is not a matter of birth, but of character. That the measure of a knight is not the arms he bears, but the promises he keeps, and that even the humblest man, if he is brave enough and true enough, can become the greatest knight who ever lived. The Temple Church in London, where William lies, survived the Great Fire of 1666 and the Blitz of 1940 and 1941, though not without damage. The effigies of the knights were harmed during the Second World War, when the church was struck by incendiary bombs, but they were carefully restored in the years that followed. Today, the church is open to visitors, and it remains a place of quiet beauty and historical resonance, a link between the modern city of London and the medieval world that gave it shape. If you ever find yourself walking through the narrow lanes between Fleet Street and the Thames, push open the heavy door and step inside. The light is dim and golden, filtered through ancient windows, and the stone floor is worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The knights lie in their rows, silent and still, their swords at their sides, their hands folded in prayer. Stand among them and listen to the silence, and think about the men who lie beneath those stones, and the world they lived in, and the stories they left behind. Epilogue: The Stone Knight. And so we come to the end of our journey, though the story of William Marshal, like all the great stories, never truly ends. It lives on in the stone effigy in the Temple Church, calm and watchful in the London light. It lives on in the pages of the Histoire, the oldest biography of a knight who was neither king nor saint. It lives on in the laws and institutions of England, shaped by the charter he helped to preserve. And it lives on in the fiction it has inspired, in the tall, stubborn, impossibly decent Ser Duncan, wandering the roads of Westeros with his battered shield and his unbreakable sense of right, a literary descendant of the real knight who walked these same virtues 800 years before. The medieval world is gone. The castles are ruins, the tournament fields are pastures, the war horses are long since turned to dust. The church that Stephen Langton led is different now, and the England that William governed has changed beyond all recognition. But the things that William Marshal stood for, loyalty, honour, courage, and the simple, powerful idea that a man's word is his most sacred possession, these things endure. They endure because they are not medieval or modern, not English or French, not historical or fictional. They are human. They are part of what we are at our best, and they are part of what we aspire to be. If you are still listening, let these images settle gently into your mind. The castle on the hill, its banners stirring in the wind. The tournament field, bright with colour and noise, and the thunder of hooves. The old knight, 70 years old, riding into battle one last time to save his country. The stone effigy in the Temple Church, lying in the golden London light, calm and still and patient, as it has lain for 8 centuries and will lie for 8 centuries more. And somewhere in the pages of a book, a tall, awkward hedge knight rides down a country road with a boy at his side, heading toward a tournament that will change his life. He does not know yet what lies ahead. He does not know the trials he will face, the choices he will have to make, the courage he will have to find. He knows only the road beneath his horse's hooves, the weight of the sword at his hip, and the promise he made to a dying old man in a ditch. A promise to be good, to be true, to be the kind of knight that the songs are written about. William Marshal kept that promise for 70 years. Ser Duncan the Tall keeps it still in the pages where he lives, and the rest of us, in our own ways and in our own lives, can keep it too. Sleep now. Let the stone knights keep their watch through the long, quiet night. The candles in the Temple Church are burning low, and the light is soft and golden, and the city outside the walls is growing still. The tournaments are over. The battles are won. The kingdom is safe. There is nothing more to be done tonight. Nothing more to worry about, nothing more to prove. You have endured, and you have been true, and the morning will come in its own good time. Until then, rest. Rest well. Good night.